These are retrieving non-human origin technical vehicles, call it spacecraft if you will, non-human, exotic origin vehicles that have either landed or crashed.
We have spacecraft from another species.
We do, yeah.
How many?
Quite a number.
You're kidding.
No.
You find him credible.
I find his position, his professional background lends him a degree of credibility that when he says the things he's saying, he can't simply be, ignored or pushed off to the side.
All right, Tom, great to talk to you.
Good to be with you.
So you've been on the UFO beat for a while, or some people call it the UAPs. But can you just set the stage for us here? What are UFOs and are they real?
Yeah, so UFOs, unidentified flying objects, are essentially things that people see in the sky that don't have a prosaic explanation, at least in the first instance. The government would refer to UFOs as UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena, which is basically the same thing. But to the government, that means stuff that is seen in the sky that is not able to be identified in a first instance. Now, after investigations take place with UFOs or UAPs, the vast majority are identified as either balloons, weather phenomena, meteorological phenomena, satellites, planes, someone having perhaps an over-exaggerated imagination. They have explanations that mean they're not UFOs or UAPs. But the special subset of UFOs that I think generates particular interest are those that seem to exhibit unconventional technical capabilities in terms of absent flight surfaces, instantaneous hypersonic acceleration, maneuvers that would appear to impose G-forces ranging into the hundreds of Gs, which we would think, how does an object withstand that kind of pressure? And then also foreign espionage tools, drones, for example, that we don't know, that look perhaps different to what we would expect a drone to look like, but is still, as with the big Chinese weather balloon, spy balloon, something that we're not quite used to.
So let's just make sure I have this right. The government has acknowledged that we have UFOs reported. We've had pilots see them. We have extensive evidence documenting them. Many of them are not aliens, but there's a subset that we don't know what they are, and but we're pretty confident they're not Russia, they're not China, and they're not us. So people then believe they probably are extraterrestrial. Do I have that right?
I think that's right. And I think it is important, though, to say that it's a very small subset of the large portfolio. But that very small subset of again, these objects that, because of, military eyewitnesses seeing them alongside radar, sonar, satellite imagery, where you have, a base of data as well as credible eyewitness reports coalescing with the same sighting, and where you have that in some circumstances going back really until into the Second World War, the mid 1940s, certainly into the late 1940s, where things start heating up. That something is going on here, and again, that the technical capabilities, if what is seen and recorded are real. And I think the abundant evidence would suggest that in some cases that we are seeing physical, objects. They are exhibiting extremely advanced, certainly flight performance technology, and that one reason why there's a significant doubt as to their being of China, Soviet, Russia, US origin is that the technical performance characteristics seen back into the earliest days of the Cold War, so let's say the late 1940s, early 1950s and on, still manifest a more advanced capability than what we have now. So we think about hypersonic, glide vehicles, fifth generation fighter jets like the F-22 and F-35 they still reside on basic principles of, fuel propulsion, flight surfaces, and constraints based on G-force and friction that perhaps do not appear to exist with this very small subset. So that's the kind of, I suppose, the scientific quandary, and what the area of UFOs that interest people like me, and I think a lot of other people.
Yeah, and that's kind of the groundwork from which we're approaching this big UFO whistleblower, David Grusch, who just came out. He filed, I believe in 2021, a report with the Inspector General for, was it for the Pentagon?
It was for the Pentagon, I believe. Yeah, in July 2021, the original one. At least that's what Leslie Keane and Blumenthal had reported in their debrief report. Yeah.
So he has come out now. He did this bombshell interview with NewsNation, and he is saying, so this is a former civilian intelligence employee. This is a former Air Force veteran, a guy who he was involved. Can you explain his connection exactly with the UAP program inside the federal government?
Sure. So the UAP task force, as it was previously known, it now exists under a different organizational title called Aero. But the UAP task force at the time that he worked with, he was the liaison from the National Reconnaissance Office, which essentially operates the spy satellites and some other stuff. And he would engage with them where there were questions that they would have, or NRO wanted to share certain things with them. So he was the liaison for the NRO with the UAP task force. But perhaps more interesting, and I think certainly what makes him at least worthy of consideration in terms of what he's saying, is that his professional background is compelling in terms of its established credentials. Career Air Force intelligence officer turned intelligence officer or analyst for the NGIA, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and then the NRO. He has a backstory of credibility and clearances and engagement with the intelligence community in a way that some purported whistleblowers, Bob Lazar, for example, simply do not have. And that credibility quotient, I think, makes him, someone that we would at least want to have a cursory look at.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to ask you next. Is just overall, you find him credible?
I find his position, his professional background, lends him a degree of credibility that when he says the things he's saying, he can't simply be ignored or pushed off to the side in a way that I would say Bob Lazar should be. And Bob Lazar is a proven liar, and various other issues that are probably a distraction to get into here. But Grusch, has a credibility in his professional background. Some of the operations that he was involved in, the clearances that he had, mean that this is not just some guy walking in off the street saying stuff, and it's too easy. And I think it's journalistic malpractice, at least at the most basic level, to say this is a strange conspiracy theorist. Maybe he is, but I think his background means that you can't jump to that point unless taking prudent steps to consider what he's saying and then examining that against the other portfolio of information or evidence.
Well, let's get into exactly what he's saying. Here is the first clip that went bonkers, that really went viral from his NewsNation interview. Take a listen.
You are one of the most trusted former intelligence officials in the US defense and intelligence establishment.
Yes, I was.
You were trusted with the most intimate secrets.
Yes.
Grusch sitting down with award-winning investigative journalist Ross Coulthart, who's reporting for NewsNation and has spent years reporting on the UFO question.
What conclusion did you come to at the end of your time on the UAP task force?
The UAP task force was refused access to a broad crash retrieval program.
When you say crash retrieval, what do you mean?
These are retrieving non-human origin technical vehicles, call it spacecraft if you will, non-human, exotic origin vehicles that have either landed or crashed.
We have spacecraft from another species.
We do, yeah.
How many?
Quite a number.
You're kidding.
No. I thought it was totally nuts, and I thought at first I was being deceived. It was a ruse. People started confiding in me. They approached me. I have plenty of current and former senior intelligence officers that came to me, many of which I knew almost my whole career, that confided in me they were a part of a program. They named the program. I've never heard of it. And they told me, based on their oral testimony, and they provided me documents and other proof, that there was, in fact, a program that the UAP task force was not read into.
Grusch alleges the U.S. government has recovered non-human craft for decades. He's filed a whistleblower complaint saying he gave what he calls the classified proof to Congress and the Intelligence Community Inspector General.
Do we have bodies? Do we have species of
Well,
non-human?
naturally, when you recover something that's either landed or crashed, sometimes you encounter dead pilots. And believe it or not, as fantastical as that sounds, it's true.
So he's saying that pretty emphatically, we have recovered UFO crafts, and the government has them. What do you make of that claim?
Well, look, I think that the challenge on this is that his and to his credit, Grusch admits this himself. His information comes from people he said worked on the program involved in this recovery. That he is not personally been engaged in that project. So there's a limit there, right? Second-hand sourcing is not as good as first-hand sourcing, and that is a significant limitation. But there have been, reports from people, across the decades. There have been evidence unconfirmed. There's a thing called the Wilson Davis memo, for example, which I have to say I was originally skeptical of and have now become kind of more open-minded about, which entails a former senior Defense Intelligence Agency officer having notes of a conversation he had with another individual, Eric Davis, in relation to possible crash recovery. There have been other similar instances going back into the Cold War period of people who were very senior ranking military officers apparently lending credence to this thing. The challenge is that we don't have, either the physical imagery, the video, the data reports, the analytical reports on studies of recovered UFOs to be able to make a definitive judgment. But Grusch is saying, and I think this is the really important point, he's gone to Congress or the intelligence oversight committees with the names and locations of people and activities associated with this recovery program. And so there should be now a baseline for Congress to either, find out that he's mistaken or has been misled, or that he's onto something and there's something for them to dig into. And one recurring thing that, it's seen as the holy grail of UFO journalism, understandably, that if you could say US recovered craft from Roswell or wherever, or craft, plural, Pulitzer's ahoy, right? And you've made your career, and that's even beyond the kind of moral and societal import that kind of, journalism would exist per se for that kind of story, right? That it's public interest and it hasn't been developed. So when I and others, I think, but I can only speak for myself, have kind of looked into this, again, holy grail of the subject, one of the challenges you come across is that people who you would think would be in a position to know, either senior political figures associated with the highest echelon, the Gang of Eight on the Intelligence Committee, on the in Congress, which is essentially the senior most top two ranking members of the House and Senate Intel committees, and then the top two ranking members per se, House Minority Leader and the Speaker, Senate Majority Leader and Senate Minority Leader, get us briefings on the most classified elements beyond even which the House and Intel committees, House and Senate Intel committees get. When you have people like that, people working in the intelligence community in terms of programs to do with exploiting foreign technology, foreign drones that have come down, analyzing what foreign militaries are researching at their highest next generation hypersonic glide vehicles. When those kind of people say that they haven't heard anything about this, it creates a challenge, because it says, well, these are people who have clearances because the government wants them to have to know or to be briefed on certain elements to do with national security. And the jumping point from that, and I know it's sort of probably hard for people to understand what I'm talking about a little bit here, is that one of the way, if this program, as Grusch suggested, it has existed in a way that is at least quasi outside the law, and far more likely, in breach of federal law, because it has been hidden essentially from reporting requirements to Congress through appropriations, and probably hidden from executive leadership right up to the president. And I think there's no way that it could have been kept secret this long unless that had been happening. And so that if
does that make the story
sense,
harder to believe that they would really do that?
To a degree, it does, but it also makes it more credible in the sense that, or more potentially credible in the sense that's the only way you could hide it, is to throw it to defense contractors, hidden programs within programs. And Tim McMillan, in his who's the executive editor of the Debrief and the original article about Grusch, did a very good two interviews with one of his reporters, kind of going into some of this, the due diligence about how this would work. And I know Tim. We're friends. We talk. I think I share his assessment as to, if this is real, this is how it would have to work. And Grusch has essentially said that he has gone to Congress and shared the classified details as to the nuts and bolts of that program, how it's been able to operate. And again, the advantage here, I would say, what makes this kind of more functionally interesting than some other whistleblower reports or some other stuff to do with the UFO subject, is that Congress now have that information, and either it's something they can look into and find legitimate or worthy, certainly, of further investigation, or they can find there's no there. And, that would obviously be disappointing for people, but there's a baseline for further investigation that's been established. And I think that's what makes this story, compelling.
Yeah. And so the two big pushbacks that I've heard, one is that it's hearsay. A lot of his claims are based on secondhand, what he has been told by very high-ranking people involved in the programs that would know. And he's also, for example, the NewsNation reporters, and they explain this in the report, so they're not overselling their scoop, that he won't show them the proof, the documents he says he has, because he says it's classified, but he does say that he has provided those to Congress in his whistleblower report. How does that, some people say, well, that just means they should dismiss this story. Some people think that's no big deal at all. How do you evaluate that critique of the credibility of this story, that it's based on hearsay or secondhand knowledge?
So one of the challenges here is that where Grusch has, I think, a legitimate excuse in saying he can't share with journalists some of the information he has, is that almost, so let's say if he is correct in what he's saying, or broadly correct, that there is this UFO recovery program, it will almost certainly have been hidden within programs to do with recovering foreign adversarial technology, Chinese and Russian drones, missiles, satellites, etc. And those programs exist, and they are very classified, because we do not want, those countries to know when we've recovered their newest, best technology. That makes sense. And were he to share that information, it would be pretty easy for the government to know, because of how tightly secured that information is, and because he prospectively had access to that information.
That'd be a crime, right, to share that?
Right. And it would be an easily indictable crime. Easier, for example, than the whole Trump situation, which, how long did he have the documents, etc. He would be very vulnerable and very quickly prosecuted. What he is able to do, and what he has said he has done, is to give Congress, under the whistleblower protections, access to documentary evidence, names, etc. And so there is that backdrop, and ultimately that either way that will come out, right? Congress does leak in a way that perhaps this program has not before, and so we have a baseline in which, if not now, certainly in the coming months, that I think will be able to judge his credibility, veracity, or certainly the credibility and veracity of what he purports to exist. I think. And what was the other question you asked? Sorry.
Just how that the hearsay element of it affects your perception.
Yeah, no, and again, I said, and in the piece I wrote on this, and obviously you mentioned it, it is, and he says this is secondhand, and I think that's that's really an important point. I mean, it's praiseworthy. There are a lot of people who I think embellish what they know in terms of some of the national security stuff when they tell sources. They say, I've heard this, and frankly, it's second, third hand, or they are regaling what they wish to have been told. But look, yes, that is a limitation. He is saying it's secondhand, but he's also saying that he has those names and data points that would allow for a verification of what he's saying. That Congress has that, and again, so that Congress factor will be the key. One thing I hinted at one thing I sort of noted in my piece is that the chairman of the House Intel Committee, because Mike Turner was asked by Bret Baier about this whistleblower, about Grusch, and said that he was kind of skeptical. Now, considering that Grusch had said that this information was presented to Congress, last year or the year before, you would expect Turner's judgment on that point to either suggest that there really isn't much to what Grusch has said, or that Turner simply hasn't received the kind of relevant briefing on it, and it's being worked through. And with the bureaucracy, as much as that sounds like a cover-up or a conspiracy, the US government bureaucracy, including the intelligence community, is absurd a lot of the time.
You don't have to convince my audience of that.
Okay. So that's probably, when we were working together, that's probably something you would say to me, right? But yeah, anyway.
So the other question that I've been seeing from a lot of people who are profoundly skeptical of this is, why would there be UFO crashes? If, for example, we are to believe that some small number of these UFOs are this super advanced extraterrestrial technology that can do, they would have to come here from other planets, other galaxies, I don't know, whatever, but from very far and have advanced technology that we have nothing close to from what's been observed and from what they would have to do to come to Earth, yet they're crashing. I mean, that's what people are skeptical of. Why would there really, with such advanced technology, you wouldn't think there would be many crashes for the US to recover materials from?
Yeah, I would. So I mean, there are a number of theories on that, right? That it could be seeding, that you would want to see how, humans respond to recovering far more advanced technology. I think the most credible explanation, again, if there have been, I suspect there have been crashes. I haven't been able to corroborate that. I mean that in terms of wreckage material versus intact or partially intact craft. We know, for example, the US Army has a current study at the moment with material that is purported to be from a UFO crash in the 1940s, and they're studying it. But maybe there's nothing to it. I think the best explanation, again, just hypothesizing as to why something would crash, would be that, well, it's using an incredibly advanced technology source, and maybe there's a malfunction in terms of something breaks down, right, and that it crashes. I think one of the challenging elements here is if there have been crashes, and bodies, as some people, as Grusch has suggested, recovered alien bodies or extra-dimensional, whatever you want to call them, non-human intelligence, bodies recovered. That's more of a stretch for me, because at a minimum, when you're talking about principles of covert activity, evading detection, that's why, for example, we like to use drones when we're doing spying on the Chinese Navy or Air Force or the Russians, in the same way they do to us, because drones can get closer without the risk of a human pilot being captured or killed. I mean, Gary Powers in the Cold War was a big scandal, and drones can be operated more clandestinely, remotely, and so if there is this technology that is so far in advanced operating these vehicles, why would you want to?
Why would you need a pilot? I was more
exactly.
skeptical.
Why would you want to? Because it becomes much easier to sort of be like, well, we had a screw up and it went down, but plausible deniability, they're going to sort of not know what the hell it is or cover it up. But if we got bodies running around, that the level of that cover up becomes a lot more difficult. And I think if you see these, the historical patterns, at least with the kind of more extraordinary UFOs, there is, at least in although they do seem to appear very publicly to large numbers of people in certain situations, there is also clearly a clandestine element. I think that there is a desire not to be seen, recorded, caught. And so, that I mean, I guess that adds the kind of fascination and mystique of the topic. But yeah, there are, I think, it's a legitimate line of inquiry to say, if they're so advanced, how have they come down?
But it's interesting, the first suggestion you made, that they could intentionally down the craft and want to see how humans would react to salvaging the technology. I hadn't considered that possibility.
That's something that some people kind of in the UFO world, as it were, suggest as a potential. I mean, I guess the top line is we don't know. I mean, there's some reports, that again, totally unverified, from the 1940s that that new radar systems interfered with the vehicles when they were operating close to the ground. Who knows?
I mean, even the most advanced technology still has bugs or glitches occasionally.
Yeah, you would assume that any technology is vulnerable, and especially if you are thinking about some of the one of the theories, I think more credible, as crazy as it sounds, as to how these vehicles would operate, which is essentially altering some kind of space-time metric around the vehicles, that you're essentially warping space. And again, we don't know that. That's a theory. That kind of technical capability would presumably be pretty complicated to operate, and that if there was a screw up, it might be a pretty significant problem for that object's ability to stay aloft. And the only reason that, well, anyway, that gets into kind of, there is some sort of data to suggest some of that or hint at it, but it's probably too, I'm going to sound crazy if you go down that rabbit hole. You've got to be, the one thing I always think with this subject that you learn more and more is that skepticism and prudence are important. There's this guy, Mick West, who does a lot of Stephen Greenstreet, who do a lot of pushback against, I'd say my reporting and other people. And I think that is healthy and necessary, because, you do not want to get over your skis with this stuff.
That's one thing I liked about NewsNation. They did this report, but they also had a bunch of skeptics on and provided the other side. They got some criticism for airing this report because it was thin in some ways, but I think that's unfair because they acknowledged it and they discussed the skeptics. And I think it's certainly newsworthy, which kind of brings me to the point that maybe we'll close out on. But I love this stuff because I'm a nerd. I'm into science fiction. I find it so fascinating and philosophically and challenging and conceptually challenging, just these very ideas. However, I think some people don't care, but they probably should, because one thing Grusch discusses is how, in his telling, if his story is true, we have recovered UFOs, intact or partially intact craft, and we're trying to recreate the technology, but so have Russia and China. And whoever gets that technology, he described it, I believe, as like a mini Cold War, like a race to get this technology. What would the ramifications of that be in terms of military, in terms of economic competition with our main adversaries?
Yeah, it's a hugely important point. It would be what's called strategic overmatch, and so one thing, for example, and I've written about this before. A guy called Robert Hastings wrote the book, not terribly originally titled "UFOs and Nukes." That is the kind of, I guess, Bible of the nuclear connection with some of these more, the truly unknown UFOs. The Chinese or Russians would be able to detect our strategic nuclear forces, anything with a nuclear signature, at very, very long range, through, I think, probably anti-neutrino detection. But these And the reason you can say that is that there are repeated sonar radar. The reason some of the assessments as to why the US Navy carrier strike groups keep seeing these things in their training areas, or who traditionally have seen them, nuclear ballistic missile submarines, why they are seen near nuclear power plants, is that there is a detection capacity for detecting nuclear signatures at very, very long range, far greater range than we have an understanding as to do. And so if you can do that, that means you could potentially launch a extremely successful first strike on any US nuclear forces, and
that sounds really bad for us.
Win the war, right? But that's the apex. That's the apex concern. But then the other, lower order concerns would be, well, cloaking, fuel sources that are, unconventional, which could be beneficial, of course. Potentially weapons capabilities. Transmedium travel, being able to, if you could have a submarine that could fly, that might be quite useful in a military sense. There are a lot of, potential things that we would want to be the first to know about, and we would not want China and Russia to be the first to know about. So, at that minimal level, right, that the Pascal's wager, my point would be, and I think this is broadly understood within the national security community, even if the people are very skeptical in some places, that you want to at least have somewhat of an eye on this issue, because even if you think it's total China, Russia, people are confused, it's crazy people saying they saw stuff, it's fighter pilots who had too little sleep and too much partying on their last shore leave. If you get that conundrum wrong and ignore it, and it does turn out to be something, and it's in Vladimir Putin's portfolio versus yours, you may have, or Xi Jinping, you may have a problem there.
You may well. Well, we will keep a close eye on this story. I find it fascinating. I keep up with all your work on the subject. Tom, thanks so much for coming on and telling us all about it.
Thanks a lot, Brad.